In discussing, supporting, or opposing a proposal, an idea, or policy, we need to define the parameters we can identify as valid and true, or at least truthful, especially when relating to the behaviors of others. Often those parameters rely on pre-established hierarchies, in which case we need to understand where those hierarchies originate. This is the case of policies, rules, and regulations, but it's also the case of principles and laws, ethical and civil, secular and religious, subjective and objective, human and personal, but also moral, social, and philosophical. But this is the case only if one believes that those areas are or ought to be separated. In other words, those who believe that they are not one and the same, at least in the sense they originate from the same core and are thus so deeply interconnected that taking them apart will nullify them, will remove the very foundations upon which they are based, thus making them impossible to follow. But why is that? Why could we say that unless those parameters above are not deeply interconnected, they will fall apart? I posit that the reason is that they are all based on something external to all of them, external to any personal, subjective, or culturally, socially dependent context, independent from personal opinions. In other words, they must depend on an external and objective, dare I say, universal, truth. Of course, to say that they must depend on this truth has two further implications. First, that they depend in both an epistemological and ontological sense, but also in a morally and ethically practical and pragmatic one. Thus, they are the way they ought to be, and if they are not, they will not satisfy their own parameters. Second, that for this truth to be external, objective, and universal, it has to be the truth, and not just a or this or that truth. Certainly, one could criticize my position. One could criticize the idea that all the rules and principles above are completely independent from an external, universal, and objective truth. In other words, and to simplify, one could believe that all those rules and principles are subjective and personal, and therefore, the very truths they're abiding by are themselves subjective and personal. These truths are indeed subjective and personal opinions, but this claim again has two further implications. First, that my very statement that there must be an external, objective, and universal truth underlying all other parameters must in itself be respected as one of the many opinions, one of the many truths there are. Certainly, this does not necessarily imply that my opinion, or any other for the matter, has more validity than another one. But these two could cause a logical fallacy, as claiming that someone's opinion is more valid, shall we say, matters, than someone else's is to claim that the judgment will have to rest again on an external, objective, and universal parameter. Second, that the statement that all rules and principles, and therefore all truths are subjective and personal, is in itself a personal opinion, which is, by definition, not the truth everyone must agree on, given that intrinsic disagreement is what this claim attempts to defend. This would be the case even if one were to say that someone's opinion is truer, as opposed to valid, as in the previous case, than someone else's. It will have to rest again on an external, objective, and universal parameter. In fact, it is indeed possible that someone's opinion is truer than someone else's. But this will be possible if, and only, if the internal elements of such objective opinion is better at approximating the external element of the objective truth. Therefore, there cannot be my truth and your truth. There can only be the truth and people's opinion. This is the importance of objective truth.